The shack was not a home. Michael had never made the mistake of calling it that. It was a lean-to of salvaged plywood and a stolen tarp wedged between two dumpsters at the dead end of the alley, low enough that a standing man would crack his skull on the crossbeam. Michael had measured it that way on purpose. Tall men in expensive shoes didn't duck into spaces like this. They didn't even look at them. Tonight, he made an exception. Getting Dmitry Petrov through the entrance was less like helping a man and more like moving furniture. Heavy, uncooperative furniture that kept trying to give orders. Dmitry grabbed the doorframe with one bloodied hand and said something sharp in a language Michael didn't speak. His voice still carrying that flat, dangerous weight even as his knees buckled. "Save it," Michael said, guiding the man's arm across his shoulder. "You can threaten me when you're not leaking." He lowered Dmitry onto the flattened cardboard that served as his floor and reached for his pack without turning the lantern up. He kept the light low by habit. Low light meant no shadows dancing on the tarp walls, no silhouettes visible from the alley mouth. He worked fast and quietly, the way he always had. He cut away the lower half of Dmitry's shirt with a folding knife, folded the fabric into a clean pad, and pressed it over the entry wound. Then he stopped. He sat back on his heels and simply listened to the man breathe. In. The chest rose unevenly, the right side lagging just a half-second behind the left. Out. A faint, wet sound. Not a gurgle, not quite, but close enough to make the back of Michael's neck go cold. He leaned forward and pressed two fingers gently along the lower right ribs. "What are you doing?" Dmitry said. It was not a question. It was a warning. Checking if your lung is still doing its job. Michael pressed again. "It is. Barely." He sat back. Small caliber. Probably a 9mm, maybe a .380. Entered below the fourth rib, angled up. If it had been a .45, we wouldn't be having this conversation. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than before. Dmitry's cold eyes moved to him slowly. The way a man's eyes move when he is recalculating something important. "You are a doctor," he said. "I'm a nobody," Michael said. "You already forgot." He tore a strip from an old cotton shirt he kept folded at the bottom of his pack. Clean, always clean. One rule he had never broken, and began wrapping it firm and flat across the wound. "A nobody," Dmitry repeated, watching him work. "Who counts rib spaces and identifies calibers by the sound of a wheeze." Michael tied off the bandage with two quick knots. A nobody who reads a lot. It was not a good lie, and both of them knew it. But Dmitry let it sit, which told Michael something about the man. He was sharp enough to know when pressing would cost him more than waiting. Outside, rain hammered the tarp. Water crept along the edge of the cardboard, and Michael shifted Dmitry's legs slightly to keep them out of it. "You're cold," Michael said. "Your body is trying to protect your core. That's normal." He pulled a folded emergency blanket from his pack, thin silver, crinkled like foil, and spread it across the man's chest without ceremony. It looked ridiculous draped over a tailored black suit jacket. Michael didn't comment on that. Dmitry looked down at the blanket, then up at the cracked plywood ceiling, then at the small stack of worn books in the corner, the thermos, the careful, organized poverty of the space. "You have been here long," he said quietly. "Long enough," Michael said. He turned the lantern down another notch and settled back against the wall, two fingers resting lightly on the inside of Dmitry's wrist. Pulse check. Slow and steady, the way all necessary things had to be done. Outside, somewhere at the far end of the block, a car door slammed. Michael's fingers didn't move, but his eyes did, sliding toward the tarp entrance. Calm and flat, and reading the dark the way only a man who had lived in it could. He counted to 4. Then he heard the footsteps. The footsteps were not trying to be quiet. That was the first thing Michael noticed. Whatever was coming down the alley wasn't afraid of being heard, which meant it was either the police or something worse. He slid his hand from Dmitry's wrist and pressed one finger to his own lips. Dmitry, to his credit, said nothing. Outside, the rain-washed dark turned white, then white again. Headlights, more than one vehicle, sweeping the mouth of the alley from the street. Michael heard the low rumble of heavy engines idling and the soft static crackle of an earpiece, the kind worn by men who coordinated before they acted. 3 seconds later, a shadow filled the gap in the tarp. The man who ducked into the lantern light was built like a door and moved like someone who had spent years walking into rooms where people didn't want him to enter. Dark jacket, collar up against the rain, a gun held low and straight at his side, the way trained men carried them, Not dramatic, just ready. His eyes swept the shack in under a second and landed on Michael with the flat, measuring look of someone deciding whether a problem needed to be removed. Then his eyes dropped to Dimitri. He went very still. "Step away from him," the man said. His voice was low and controlled, the accent faint but present, somewhere warm. Somewhere far from this wet alley. Michael didn't move. "I can't do that," he said. "I won't ask twice. I'm not being difficult." Michael kept his voice even. The same tone he had once used to calm panicked families in bright, clean corridors that felt like a different life entirely. "My left hand is holding pressure on a bleeder near his inner thigh. If I move it, he has about 4 minutes. Maybe less." The gun came up. Dimitri's voice cut across the shack like a flat stone thrown hard. "Ivan." One word. The gun didn't lower, but the man, Ivan, stopped breathing for a moment. "He's telling the truth," Dimitri said. He sounded tired now, the authority in his voice thinned by blood loss, but still present the way iron is still iron even when it's cold. "Stand down." Ivan's eyes stayed on Michael for a long, careful moment. Then he lowered the gun 2 inches. Not all the way. Just enough to signal that the conversation could continue. "Who is he?" Ivan asked, directing the question at Dimitri, but not looking away from Michael. "Nobody," Dimitri said. And something in his tone had shifted slightly from the first time he'd said it. Less dismissal, more something that Michael couldn't quite name. Ivan moved further into the shack, filling the small space considerably. He glanced at the bandaged wound, the silver blanket, the clean strips of cotton. His expression didn't change, but his eyes did, registering details the way experienced men register things they don't yet understand. Outside, more car doors. Boots on wet pavement, disciplined and deliberate. "The whole block," Michael said quietly. 8 men, Ivan confirmed, without apology. "The ones who did this are still in the area." He looked at Dimitri. "We need to move him." "No." Michael's voice was calm and flat. "His pressure is low, and the bleed isn't fully controlled. Moving him right now without a proper clamp is how you finish the job those 8 men started." Ivan stared at him. Michael stared back. It was Michael knew. A strange kind of standoff. A man with a gun and a small army outside against a man with nothing but a piece of folded cotton and the knowledge of exactly how fragile a human body was. He had no weapons, no leverage, no authority that the world outside this tarp would recognize. But Ivan's boss was breathing because of his hands. And all 3 of them understood that. Ivan slid the gun into his holster slowly. He pulled out his phone, tapped something brief, and put it away. "You have 20 minutes, he said. "After that, I'm carrying him out myself." 30, Michael said. Ivan's jaw tightened. 25, Michael said. "And I need your belt." For the first time since entering the shack, Ivan Sanchez looked genuinely uncertain. He glanced at Dimitri. Dimitri closed his eyes. "Give him the belt." "Ivan," he said quietly. The belt made a decent enough substitute. Not ideal. Michael would have preferred a proper tourniquet. The kind with a windlass and a flat nylon strap. But the leather was thick and Ivan was the kind of man who wore his belt tight, which helped. Michael looped it high on Dimitri's inner thigh, fed the tongue through, and pulled it in one slow, firm motion until he felt the resistance he was looking for. Dimitri's breath hissed through his teeth. "That's supposed to hurt," Michael said. "It means it's working." He didn't look up when he said it. He was already checking the pressure with 2 fingers, reading the pulse below the strap the way a mechanic listens to an engine. Not for the sound itself, but for what it meant. The lantern flickered. Ivan reached up and steadied it with one hand, holding the hook it hung from against the low ceiling. It was a small gesture. Practical and without sentiment, but Michael noted it. The enforcer was adapting. "Good. There is a hospital," Ivan said, 12 minutes from here. "Private. Clean. Our doctor is already." "Your doctor," Michael said quietly, "is not here." He peeled back the cotton pad and looked at the wound in the steadier light. The bleeding had slowed to a seep rather than a push. He pressed the pad back, firm and flat. "The bullet didn't exit," he said, more to himself than to either of them. "It's sitting against the muscle. Not in the artery, or he'd already be gone. But close enough that one wrong movement shifts it." He looked at Ivan. "That's why he cannot be moved." "Not yet." Ivan said nothing. Dimitri had been watching Michael work with the same focused, unreadable expression he'd worn since the shack. But now his eyes moved down to his own hands resting on the silver blanket, the thick gold ring on his right hand catching the lantern light. the dried blood in the grooves of it dark and dull. "I want you to understand something," Michael said, following the man's gaze without meaning to. He kept his voice even. Clinical, the way he'd been trained to deliver hard truths to people who weren't used to receiving them. "That ring, the watch. The suit, none of it is doing anything useful right now. Gold doesn't clot blood. Silk doesn't seal a wound." He pressed the pad again, checking. "Right now, the most valuable thing within 1 mile of this alley is a piece of someone else's old cotton shirt and a belt from a man who looks like he bench presses truck engines." Ivan made a sound that was almost, not quite, a short laugh. Dmitri did not laugh. But something shifted in his face, a hairline crack in the cold, controlled surface of it. Not fear exactly. Something quieter than fear. Something more honest. "You have done this before," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't quite a question either. Michael was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain had softened to a steady drizzle, and somewhere at the end of the block one of Ivan's men was speaking low into a radio. "A long time ago," Michael said. "Where?" "Somewhere with better lighting and worse outcomes." He reached into his pack and pulled out a small bottle of antiseptic, nearly empty, rationed carefully for months, and applied what remained without hesitation. The last of it, for a stranger. He didn't examine the decision. He just made it. Dmitri watched the bottle tip and empty. "That was your last one," he said. "Yes." "Why?" Michael set the bottle down and looked at the man properly for the first time since they'd been in the light together. The cut along his cheek. The gray at his temples. The way his eyes carried the permanent tiredness of someone who had been powerful for so long he'd forgotten what it cost. "Because you're bleeding," Michael said simply. "That's the only reason I need." Dmitri was silent for a long moment. Then he looked away, toward the dark corner of the shack. And Michael recognized that particular stillness. He'd seen it before, in different rooms, on different faces. It was the stillness of a man quietly meeting his own mortality for the very first time. The lantern flickered again. Michael reached up and turned the wick just slightly higher, giving the man a little more light. The radio crackle came first, then the blue and red light. It didn't push through the tarp the way the headlights had. It came in softer, pulsing through the gaps in the plywood like a slow heartbeat, painting the walls of the shack in alternating color. Michael had seen that rhythm so many times from the inside of dark spaces that his body recognized it before his mind did. His shoulders dropped half an inch. Police. Different problem. Equally dangerous. Ivan had moved to the entrance before Michael could speak. One hand on the tarp, but Michael caught his eye and shook his head once. Ivan read it correctly and stayed still. A large man with a gun appearing at the mouth of a dark alley would not help anyone tonight. The voice came from above and to the left, the narrow ground-level window of the basement wall that formed the back of Michael's shelter. A woman's voice, direct and unhurried. The kind that had learned not to shout because shouting made people run. "This is Detective Reginald. I need whoever's in there to talk to me." Michael looked at Dmitri. Dmitri's jaw was set, eyes forward. Michael looked at Ivan. Ivan's hand was resting on his holster. Michael held up 2 fingers. "Wait." He moved to the window, a rectangle of reinforced glass barely wider than his shoulders, crisscrossed with old wire, and crouched until he could see the lower half of a figure standing in the alley. Dark trousers, sensible boots. A detective's badge clipped to the belt catching the red and blue light. "I'm here," Michael said. A pause. The boots shifted, then crouched, and a face came down level with the window. She was somewhere in her 40s, sharp-featured, with the kind of patient eyes that had heard every lie in the book and had simply started cataloging new ones. She took in Michael's face, the dim light behind him, and the edge of the silver blanket visible past his shoulder. "You alone?" she asked. "No," Michael said. "I've got a sick man in here." She didn't blink. "What kind of sick?" "The kind that doesn't need an ambulance." He kept his voice steady and quiet. "He drank too much and he fell. He's cut up. I'm keeping him warm." Her eyes moved past him, slow and deliberate. Michael didn't turn around. He trusted that Ivan had the sense to be invisible, and that Dmitri had the self-control to look like a very still, very drunk man rather than the bleeding head of a criminal organization. "We've had reports of gunshots in this block," the detective said. 20 minutes ago. "I heard them too," Michael said. "From the north end. I brought him in here after because the rain was bad and I didn't want trouble." "Where did you find him?" "Near the dumpsters. He was sitting against the wall." She studied him. Michael had been studied by doctors, by hospital boards, by a courtroom full of people who had already made up their minds about him. He knew how to hold a face still under that kind of weight. He needs a hospital, she said. He needs sleep and warmth, Michael said. He's refused a hospital. He's conscious, and he's allowed to do that. I'd like to confirm that myself. Detective. Michael kept his voice respectful and level. I've been sleeping in this alley for 4 years. I know my rights and I know his. You're welcome to come back in the morning when he's sober and standing and can tell you himself. Right now, the best thing for him is to stay still and stay warm. The silence between them stretched like a wire being pulled tight. She looked at him for a long moment. Really looked, the way good detectives did, searching for the tremor in the voice or the glance that went the wrong way. Michael gave her nothing to find. You have a name? She asked. Michael. Michael. She said it once, like she was filing it. If he gets worse, you call for help. You understand me? Pride doesn't stitch wounds. I know that better than most, Michael said. She held his gaze one final second. Then she straightened up and her boots moved away from the window, slow and deliberate, the badge light disappearing around the corner. Michael stayed crouched at the window until the pulse of blue and red faded from the walls. Then he pressed his fingers back to Dimitri's wrist without a word. The pulse was still there. For now, that was enough. The quiet after Detective Reginald left lasted exactly 4 minutes. Michael knew because he was counting Dimitri's pulse. 1 beat at a time, and 4 minutes of a resting heart rate was something his hands had learned to measure the way other men measured distance or money. It was one of the things that had never left him, no matter how hard everything else had. Then he heard the boots. Not Ivan's men. He knew the pattern of Ivan's men by now. They moved in a loose perimeter, checking and returning, a rhythm like a slow clock. These boots were different. They came from the east end of the block, which Ivan's men were not covering, and they moved in a tight cluster, close together. The way men moved when they were closing in rather than watching. Ivan heard it too. His head turned toward the tarp, and his hand went to his holster in one smooth motion. Michael held up a single finger. 1 moment. He listened. For sets of boots. Maybe 5. They were on the pavement above, the street level. Not the alley, moving parallel to the building, slow and deliberate. Testing. A flashlight beam crossed the gap between the dumpsters at the alley entrance, swept the ground, and disappeared. They were checking entry points. Michael sat back on his heels and looked at Dimitri with the same calm expression he used when the situation had moved past the point where expressions were useful. Can you walk? He asked quietly. Dimitri's jaw tightened. He shifted his weight onto one elbow and stopped. The pain crossed his face quickly and cleanly, like a blade. And Michael watched him calculate it and come to the same answer Michael had already reached. No, Dimitri said. The word cost him something. Michael nodded once. He had expected it. The tourniquet controlled the bleed, but it didn't restore what had already been lost. And a man running on blood pressure that low would make it approximately 4 steps before the alley floor came up to meet him. He turned to Ivan. The East End, Michael said. I know. Ivan already had his phone out. He typed without looking at the screen, the message short. 2 of his men outside shifted. Michael could track it by the change in footstep patterns. 1 moved toward the alley mouth. 1 moved deeper into the block from the other side. Not enough. Michael could see Ivan calculating it too, the same math, arriving at the same uncomfortable answer. 2 men repositioned left a gap. And the boots above were already descending. A fire escape on the far wall, the metal steps ringing softly under careful weight. Michael looked around the shack. He looked at his pack. At the lantern. At the small, organized collection of everything he owned. Which amounted to less than most people spent on a single dinner, but which he knew with the precise intimacy of a surgeon who understood that the right tool in the right hand was the only thing standing between a living person and a dead one. He looked at Dimitri. I can't move you, Michael said. It was not an apology. It was a clinical statement of fact. The same way he had once told families hard truths in corridors that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air. Your pressure is too low, and the bullet shifts if you're carried. If it moves another 2 centimeters, no belt and no cotton is going to matter. Dimitri looked at him steadily. Then what? Then I finish what I started. Michael pulled his pack toward him and began laying items out on the cardboard with quiet efficiency. The bottle of high-end vodka Ivan's man had retrieved from the SUV at Michael's earlier request. A sealed pack of medical sutures, old, salvaged, but sterile. A curved needle. The small folding knife, blade cleaned and held briefly in the vodka flame. His hands were completely still. Ivan watched him with an expression that had moved somewhere past uncertainty and arrived at something close to respect, though the man would likely never say so. Above them, the fire escape groaned under a final descending step. Then silence. Then a knock on the dumpster, 3 slow, deliberate strikes of something metal against steel. The kind of knock that wasn't asking permission. Michael didn't look up from his instruments. "Ivan," he said quietly. "I need 10 minutes and a closed door." He uncapped the vodka. "Make sure I get them." The first gunshot came from the alley mouth before Michael made his first cut. He didn't flinch. He had operated through worse, through the shake of his own hands, through the weight of a courtroom verdict sitting in his chest, through the specific silence of a room where a patient had just stopped being a patient. A single gunshot from 20 feet away was comparatively manageable. Ivan had stepped outside without ceremony, pulling the tarp closed behind him. The sounds that followed were brief and controlled. 2 shots, a scuffle. The hard crack of something solid meeting something harder. Then Ivan's voice, low and sharp, directing his men in short words that needed no translation. Michael worked. The vodka went first, across his hands, across the knife blade, across the wound site in a slow, careful pour that made Dmitri pull a sharp breath through his nose. Michael had found the bottle earlier in a split garbage bag 2 blocks over, a $300 single malt that someone had discarded still 3/4 full. He had carried it back to the shack without drinking a drop. Old habit. Surgeons didn't drink before a procedure. He had almost smiled at himself for thinking it. The medical waste had come from Dr. Henry Collins, a name Michael knew from the labels on the boxes. A private practitioner 2 streets over who disposed of his expired supplies in the large blue bin behind his office. Michael had been quietly retrieving useful items from that bin for 8 months. Expired didn't mean useless. Sterile packaging that had passed its printed date was still sealed. Still clean, still functional in the hands of someone who understood the difference between a legal standard and an actual one. Tonight, those salvaged supplies were the difference between a living man and a dead one. He worked by feel as much as by sight. The lantern held steady by a loop of wire Ivan had rigged before leaving. The curved needle was small, and the suture thread was finer than ideal for this depth of tissue. But it would hold if placed correctly, and Michael had always placed things correctly. That, at least, the years had not taken from him. "Talk," Dmitri said. His voice was thinner now, stretched by pain and blood loss. But his eyes were open and fixed on the ceiling with the determined focus of a man refusing to lose consciousness through sheer will alone. "About what?" Michael said. "Anything. Keep me awake." Michael considered. Outside, another short burst of sound, boots, a raised voice, Ivan's flat response cutting it off. "The human femoral artery," Michael said. "Working as he spoke, carries roughly 1/4 of the heart's entire output. If it's fully severed, a person loses consciousness in under a minute." He placed the first suture. "Yours wasn't fully severed." The bullet pushed against the wall of the vessel without breaking through, like pressing a thumb against a garden hose. Second suture. "The bleed you have is from the surrounding muscle tissue and a small accessory vessel. Painful and dangerous, but survivable if addressed correctly." Dmitri was quiet for a moment. "You are describing my own body to keep me calm. It's working, isn't it?" A pause. "Yes." Third suture. Michael worked with the focused stillness of a man who had disappeared entirely into the task, which was the only way the task had ever been possible. Not silence exactly. Outside the tarp the night was full of movement and consequence, but a private quiet that existed only in the small space between his hands and the work. He thought, briefly and without meaning to, of the last time he had felt this. The smell of a proper oar. The weight of a real instrument. The complete, consuming certainty of knowing exactly what needed to be done. He closed the thought like a door and kept working. The bullet came out with the careful pressure of 2 improvised retractors, bent spoon handles sterilized, a solution so simple it would have embarrassed him once and didn't now. It was small and dark, and he set it on a clean piece of foil without comment. "Done," he said. Dmitri exhaled slowly. The sound of a man setting down something very heavy. Michael began closing the outer tissue in neat, even stitches, each one placed with the same precision as the first. Outside, the boots had gone quiet. The vodka bottle stood half empty beside him, catching the lantern light. Michael didn't look at it. He tied off the final stitch, leaned back, and pressed 2 fingers to Dimitri's wrist. Steady, slow, present. He closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then he opened them and reached for the last clean strip of cotton. There was still work to do. Ivan came back through the tarp with blood on his collar and the calm expression of a man who had just finished a task he found unpleasant but necessary. He looked at Dimitri first. That was instinct, the enforcer checking the principle, the way a guard dog's eyes go to the thing it protects before anything else. What he saw made his shoulders drop a fraction. Not much, just enough. Dimitri was breathing evenly. The silver blanket rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm. The wound was dressed cleanly, the improvised bandage flat and properly tensioned, and the tourniquet had been loosened 2 notches now that the deeper bleed was closed. The alley mud and the flickering lantern and the salvage supplies were still absurd in the presence of the man's expensive suit, but the suit no longer mattered. He was alive. That was the only measurement that counted tonight. Ivan's eyes moved to Michael, who was repacking his supplies in their specific order. Antiseptic materials first. Cutting tools wrapped and separate, suture remnants folded into a clean square. The same order every time. Another habit that had never died. 3 of them, Ivan said. 2 ran. Michael nodded without looking up. The ones who ran will report back. Yes. So we have less time than before. Yes. Michael tied the top of his pack and set it aside. Then he looked at Ivan directly. The way he rarely looked at people, fully, without the careful distance he kept between himself and the world. I need you to understand something, Michael said. He cannot be moved for at least another 40 minutes. The outer stitches will hold, but the internal tissue needs time to begin closing on its own. If he's carried before that, the movement breaks the seal. He paused. If that happens, I can't fix it a second time. Not here. Ivan was quiet. Behind his eyes, the same calculation Michael had watched him run several times tonight. Threat assessment, resource assessment. The mental arithmetic of a man whose entire profession was managing dangerous situations. 40 minutes, Ivan said. Minimum. Ivan pulled out his phone. He made 2 calls, both short. After the second, he moved to the tarp entrance and stood with his back to it, arms at his sides, facing inward. A door that had decided to become a wall. Michael looked at him. I'll need you to do exactly what I say for the next 40 minutes, Michael said. Not because I outrank you. Because I'm the only person in this alley who knows what kills him and what doesn't. Ivan considered this for a moment. And if I disagree with your instructions? Then you tell me why, and we discuss it in under 10 seconds. Michael held the man's gaze. But you don't move him, and you don't let anyone through that door without my say. Not your men, not the detective, not anyone. The corner of Ivan's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more complicated than that. The expression of a man who had spent his entire adult life operating inside a rigid hierarchy and had just been handed a set of instructions from a person who, by every external measure, had no authority whatsoever, and had followed them anyway. Understood, Ivan said. He turned back to face the entrance. Michael moved to Dimitri's side and checked the pulse again. Still steady. He adjusted the blanket and checked the color of the man's fingertips, still warm enough. Good. Your man, Dimitri said quietly. His voice was stronger now, the thin stretched quality gone, replaced by something closer to his natural register. He doesn't follow instructions easily. I noticed, Michael said. He has followed yours all night. Michael didn't answer immediately. He was checking the dressing, pressing gently at the edges to confirm the seal. People follow instructions when they trust the source, he said finally. He doesn't trust me, but he trusts what he's seen. Michael sat back. That's enough. Dimitri turned his head slightly and looked at Ivan's broad back filling the tarp entrance. Steady, immovable, facing outward into the dark. Then he looked at Michael. In my world, Dimitri said slowly, a man's authority comes from what he owns or what he controls. Michael reached for the lantern and turned the wick up a half notch. In mine, he said, it comes from what he knows. Outside, the rain had started again. Ivan didn't move. The 40 minutes passed the way difficult things always passed, slowly at first. Then all at once. Ivan's men dealt with the second approach quietly and without drama. Michael heard it from inside the shack, a brief commotion at the far end of the block. 2 sharp sounds, then the specific silence that followed when a threat had been removed rather than postponed. Ivan received a message on his phone, read it, and said nothing. His posture told Michael everything. It was over. Dmitri had drifted into a light sleep around the 30-minute mark, which was correct and expected. The body, when it had been through what it had, made its own decisions about rest. Michael had checked his pulse every 5 minutes without fail, and each time the beat came back steady, and even, like a metronome, that had decided to keep going despite everything. When Dmitri opened his eyes fully, the lantern was burning at its highest, and the rain outside had reduced to a quiet drip from the tarp edge. He lay still for a moment, orienting himself the way people did when they woke in unfamiliar places, taking in the ceiling, the light, the smell of antiseptic and wet cardboard. Then his eyes found Michael, sitting against the opposite wall with his knees up and his hands resting loose in his lap. "Still here," Dmitri said. "Still here," Michael agreed. Dmitri shifted carefully, testing his body the way an experienced man tested damaged things, slowly, with attention, without panic. He found the limits of comfortable movement and stayed inside them. "How long?" he said. "Just over an hour." Michael checked his watch, a cheap digital one, cracked screen, still accurate. "Your men handled the second group about 20 minutes ago. Ivan has the block." Dmitri was quiet for a moment. Then he reached inside his jacket with his good arm. A slow and deliberate movement. He produced a slim, dark card holder, opened it, and held it toward Michael between 2 fingers. "There is an account number on the back," he said. "Whatever you decide is a fair amount, transfer it. There is no ceiling." Michael looked at the card. He didn't take it. "I don't need your money," he said. Dmitri's expression remained neutral. "Everyone needs money." "I need very little," Michael said. "I've been living on very little for 4 years. It turns out most of what people spend money on is distance. Distance from discomfort, distance from other people, distance from the parts of themselves they don't want to look at." He looked at the card with the same clinical detachment he applied to everything. "Money is efficient for that. I stopped running a while ago." Dmitri lowered the card slowly. He studied Michael with the focused attention of a man who was accustomed to understanding people quickly and was finding, for the second time tonight, that this particular person required more time than expected. "You saved my life," Dmitri said. "In my world, that creates a debt. A debt requires payment. In your world," Michael said, "debts get people killed." He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. "I watched 3 men get shot tonight within 50 feet of where I'm sitting. That's what your system of debts and payments looks like from the outside. It's extraordinarily inefficient." Something moved behind Dmitri's eyes. "A scalpel," Michael continued, "is 3 inches long and costs less than a decent meal. In the right hands, it does something no amount of armed men can do. It fixes the problem precisely, without destroying everything around it." He sat back. "Your entire operation tonight, the ambush, the counter-response, the hit squad, the vehicles, the men, all of it to handle a problem that a single conversation, handled correctly, might have prevented." Dmitri was very still. "You're lecturing me," he said. His tone was unreadable. "I'm observing," Michael said. "You asked me to take payment. I'm explaining why the transaction doesn't balance." A long silence settled between them. Outside, Ivan spoke quietly to someone and footsteps moved away. Dmitri looked at the card in his hand for a moment. Then he looked at Michael, at the worn green jacket, the careful hands. The calm eyes of a man who had lost everything and was, somehow, the most settled person in the room. He put the card away. "Then what?" Dmitri said quietly. "Do you want?" Michael looked at his own hands. For the first time in a very long time, he allowed himself to answer honestly. Dawn came slowly, the way it always did in the city, not as a sudden brightness, but as a gradual lessening of dark, the black sky turning gray at its edges like a bruise beginning to heal. Michael heard the private ambulance before he saw it. A quiet engine, no sirens, moving with the unhurried confidence of a vehicle that didn't need to announce itself. It pulled into the alley mouth and 2 men stepped out, clean, professional, carrying a proper stretcher with the efficient movements of people who had done this many times in places that didn't ask questions. Dmitri's men. Ivan directed them without raising his voice, pointing once, and they moved to the shack entrance and crouched and waited. Michael did a final check, pulse, dressing, temperature of the skin at the wrist, and then stepped back and nodded. They lifted Dmitri with practiced care, transferring him to the stretcher in one smooth motion. Dmitri said nothing during the move. He kept his eyes forward and his jaw set, and Michael respected that. Dignity was one of the few things that didn't require money or status. It was just a decision a person made about how to carry themselves, and Dmitri had made it consistently all night. At the stretcher, before the men wheeled him toward the ambulance, Dmitri turned his head toward Michael. He didn't say thank you. Michael hadn't expected him to. Men like Dmitri Petrov didn't traffic in thank yous. The word was too small for what had passed between them tonight, and they both understood that. Instead, Dmitri reached into his jacket and produced a single business card. Plain white, no logo, just an address printed in clean black type, and a phone number beneath it. The building has been empty for 2 years, Dmitri said. It has running water, a clean interior, and a loading bay suitable for medical deliveries. His voice was level and precise. The deed will be transferred by end of week. Licenses, equipment, and operating permissions will be handled. All of it clean, all of it legal. He paused. The neighborhood has needed a free clinic for a long time. Michael looked at the card. He took it. Dmitri held his gaze for one final moment. Not the cold, measuring look of a man assessing a threat, but something older and quieter than that. The look of a person who had been genuinely seen by another person, perhaps for the first time in years, and was still deciding how to carry that. Then the stretcher moved and Dmitri Petrov was wheeled into the gray morning light and loaded with careful efficiency into the back of the ambulance. Ivan was the last to leave. He stopped at the alley entrance and looked back at Michael, standing in front of the shack in his worn green jacket, the business card held loosely in one hand. Ivan reached into his pocket and held something out. Michael's beanie. It had come off during the night, somewhere in the controlled chaos of the last few hours. Michael looked at it. He didn't take it. Ivan held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once, a short, clean acknowledgement. One professional to another, and walked to the waiting SUV and was gone. The alley was quiet. Michael stood in the early morning gray and looked at the business card in his hand. The address was 3 blocks east. He knew the building, a solid brick structure with wide windows that let in good light, the kind of light that was useful in a medical setting. He had walked past it many times without allowing himself to look at it directly. He allowed himself to look at it now. His hands were clean. He had washed them with the last of the water in his thermos when the work was finished, scrubbing with the same thorough method that had been trained into him so deeply it lived in his muscles rather than his memory. 30 seconds. Every surface. The spaces between the fingers. He looked at his hands in the gray morning light. They were steady. They had been steady all night. Through the blood and the boots and the blue and red light, and the single malt vodka standing open beside him like a question he had chosen not to answer. He put the business card carefully into his inside pocket, close to his chest. Then Michael John straightened his back, lifted his chin, and walked out of the alley into the morning. He knew his name. He knew exactly what it was worth.